I tested more than 40 different Invocator builds, killed this 5 million HP dummy here over 150 times to find out how you can deal the most damage against bosses as an Invocator. Now you might be asking, why the heck are you doing that? First of all, because I have nothing better to do in the game right now. But secondly, when it comes to the Invocator, there are plenty of different build options for skills, masteries, and even for the gear. There are just so many different options. And I thought, why not do a test to find out what is actually the best build? I split this test into two parts. First of all, I needed a baseline. To get a baseline, I created 3 different skill builds, 6 different mastery pages, and 2 different gear sets. Now the 3 skill layouts cover most of the builds that you can currently find out there. From really dot heavy builds which focus a lot on curse damage, to a build that focuses less on dots, so less on curse abilities, and goes more into staff abilities. For the masteries, it gets really interesting because there are so many good possibilities, especially for the ones in a ring. All of those 4 mastery nodes can be really good, but the problem is that you can only have 2 nodes at the same time active. So I thought, why not test every possible combination, which brings us here to 6 different layouts. Maybe there's a combination that is really good, but no one has ever thought about. For the gear, I prepared 2 different sets. The first one has a 2-piece Spectral plus a 2-piece Ardent set. And the second one, we replace the Ardent 2-piece with a Vanquisher 2-piece. The idea here is to find out if the Vanquisher 2-piece is actually worth it for the Invocator or not. Yes, these are not the best 2 pieces from the Vanquisher set, but it will give us an idea if it's a good or a bad set. Now in this first part of the test, I combined every skill layout with every mastery page and with both of the gear sets, which gives us already 36 different build combinations. And these results would be my basis. I could then just take other builds and compare them to my first results. One thing before we come to the results, let me explain how I did my testing. With every build, I killed the 5 million HP dummy at least 3 times in a row. If I had a huge difference in my results, I would kill the dummy 1 or 2 times more to confirm the actual results. But this didn't happen too often. Most of the time it was just pretty clear. Good thing about killing a dummy with 5 million HP, I guess. Then I only used normal Stellarites, no remedy, buff food or guardian. Additionally, a little bit of a disclaimer here, dot builds of course generally have a little bit of an advantage because you don't have a deadly marker which will reduce all your cooldowns, which would benefit builds that are not focused on dots. But nevertheless, the test will give us a good idea of what is a good build for bosses and what is not a good build. Okay, so let's come to the results. After I did all the testing, I had this huge table here with 3 times for each build. I created of course an average out of those 3 times, which gives us then 1 final time for each build. Now before we look closer on this table and the final winner, let's have a look onto the performance of the gear, the masteries and the skills separately. Let's start with the gear. So the question I asked myself, how good is the 2-piece Vanquisher set? I know a lot of people assume it's BIS, and for sure it's a lot better than a 2-piece Ardent set, right? No. On average, I needed around 120 seconds to kill the 5 million HP dummy with the Vanquisher 2-piece, but only 110 seconds with the Ardent 2-piece. So I lost around 8% damage throughout all my tests. So why is this? First of all, if you test the damage increase of your dots with the Vanquisher set, you will quickly see it's not 20%. From my testing, it's something around 8%. But additionally, what you have to understand is that in Throne of Liberty, most of your damage comes from your gear. Let's say you get an item that gives you 100 heavy attack chance. Now, depending on how much heavy attack chance you already have, that could give you a damage increase of 5 to 8%. It's not just a dot damage increase, it's just an overall damage increase. That's how broken some stats are. People are often tunnel on set bonuses or stuff like this, but it's way more important to get the right stats, simply because the stats are so broken in this game. Of course, the combination I had here wasn't the best, but you will always have to make sacrifices to get this 2-piece set, which I think is just never worth it, because most of the time you will just sacrifice other stats that are just way too important. Now we clarified that the Vanquisher 2-piece is not that good. Now the question, what about the Masteries? The winner of this is not that surprising for most people, but what is really interesting is that it surprisingly crosses across the board. The one with a Devotion of Emptiness and with Vampiric Onslaught wins with around 112 seconds on average, but all the other ones are actually pretty close to our winner. Just the more exotic ones with Malicious Focus and Battle Spirit was on average around 7% slower. All the other ones were only a few percentage slower. So nothing too special here, but I was just really surprised that it's that close here. That just shows that all of those 4 Masteries are just really incredible good in PvE. Now let's come to the skills. Here again, also not a huge difference. On average, all those builds deal almost the same damage. But the winner is the build that is not focusing on dots so much, which I think is really interesting. This is the build where we play with Ice Bombardment and Inferno Wave. So we play with as many staff abilities as possible. And this build deals on average the most damage. But of course the difference here between the different builds was not too big. But now the big question, which combination had the best time? And it's actually exactly the combination of our 3 winners. So for the gear, we go with the Ardent 2-piece and the Spectral 2-piece. For the Masteries, we go with Devotion of Emptiness and Vampiric Onslaught. And for the skills, we focus on the one that doesn't focus on dots. On average, it took us around 99 seconds to kill a 5 million HP dummy. If we look at the percentage difference here, we can see clear differences in the build. It might not be so impactful to pick the right skills or masteries on their own, but the combination of everything really adds up. Even if you completely min-max your gear, go with better stellarites and so on, you will of course reduce the time even more. Now I had this build and the time as a reference, and I was able to test other builds and always compare them to this build. I needed to beat my average time of 99 seconds. First of all, I tried different variations of this build where, for example, went with the serial firebombs instead of the focus firebombs, or I went with the heat fusion upgrade to change our ice spear. But it didn't matter what I did, the initial layout was just performing the best. I even tested some completely different builds with different masteries that some guys from my community shared with me that I found online. Just every build that I could somehow get. But none of those builds were able to compete with this build. Now here you can see my skill specialization that I used. I think really nothing too special. Only thing that is for me just important are these mobility upgrades. Of course, this is not increasing your DPS against bosses, but if you do dimensional trials, you need those upgrades, otherwise it's just super annoying to play with those abilities. For the masteries, also nothing too special. Just one thing I did here compared to my earlier build, which I want to highlight again, is that we focus now more on auto attacks. Especially against dummies, but also in dungeons, since the Deadly Marker nerf, you will do a lot of auto attacks, even if you have a lot of cooldown speed. So boosting the damage of your auto attacks just makes a lot of sense. So going for Corrupting Hit from the wand and going for dual cast from the staff just makes a lot of sense. Of course, the dummy test is not a dungeon setting, but I think this test is still pretty accurate. Sadly, I don't have a tavern wand. It would have been insane to also integrate that here into the testing. But yeah, I hope this was helpful and gives you a reason to test a new build. If you like the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching and see ya in the next one.